It was the kind of town where the air smelled like gasoline and gossip, and silence only broke for trucks or trouble. At 3:42 p.m., Malik Johnson, 13, stood alone at a payphone outside a rusted gas station on Highway 7. The sun beat down on the cracked concrete. In his hand, the receiver was slick with sweat, not from fear, but precision. Every word he spoke had weight. Echo 7 Alpha, ongoing, code blue, location marked, target observed. Across the street, Officer Dempsey leaned against his patrol car with the ease of someone who had power in places power should never reach. When he spotted Malik, his jaw tensed. A black kid using a payphone with that look in his eye? That wasn't usual. That wasn't small-town quiet. He crossed the lot like a man checking on a loose dog, slow, suspicious, already assuming guilt. "You making prank calls?" he asked, voice heavy with condescension. Malik kept his eyes forward, calm. "I'm reporting something." Dempsey stepped closer. "To who?" "The Bureau." That did it. The officer scoffed, laughed with his whole mouth, but not with his eyes. "The FBI doesn't talk to kids. Who do you think you are?" Malik didn't blink. He lowered the receiver just enough to speak clearly. "I think I'm someone who sees things you don't want seen." The laughter stopped. Dempsey's hand shifted toward his belt, not quite on his holster, but near enough. "You think you're clever? Don't lie to me, boy." And that word, liar, hung in the air like smoke. Malik raised the phone again, speaking slowly, deliberately. "This call is monitored. Officer's name logged. Protocol 9 engaged." Dempsey's smile cracked. It didn't break all at once. It twitched, resisted, then faded. He grabbed the phone from Malik's hand and slammed it onto the cradle. "You don't talk to the FBI," he muttered. "Not in my town." But then his own phone buzzed. Once, then again, then a third time, the kind of triple ring no local line ever gave. He looked down. The number was blocked. The screen flashed white. And Malik? He stepped back, slowly, hands raised, not in fear, but formality. "They're calling you now," he said. "You should answer." Dempsey hesitated, finger hovering. When he finally pressed accept, the voice on the other end wasn't local, wasn't casual, and sure wasn't kind. "Officer Dempsey," it said, cold as steel, "step away from the child. You're being recorded." The world didn't tilt. It shifted quietly, like a lock turning from the inside. No sirens, no shouting, just the unbearable weight of realization. Because what Malik saw, and what he knew, wasn't just dangerous, it was federal. And this time the smallest voice in the room didn't ask for help. He delivered it. Malik Johnson wasn't built for trouble. He was built for precision. Even as a kid, everything about him was measured. His words, his silence, his footsteps. He didn't talk much at school, but when he did, teachers paused. Not because he was loud, but because he was exact. His classmates didn't know what to make of him. Quiet black boy. Top grades. Reads court transcripts for fun. Notebooks are always neat. Eyes that studied people like puzzles. They called him weird. His mother called him prepared. Her name was Nicole Johnson, and in Washington circles it carried more weight than most judges. A decorated FBI counterintelligence agent, Nicole specialized in operations where identities were hidden and survival meant thinking 10 steps ahead. But the country didn't know her name. That was the job. What mattered more was that her son did. Because if anything happened to her, Malik was the fail-safe. A walking file. A breathing backup drive. A witness who could be trusted because he was trained to be. Nicole raised Malik in the kind of quiet that holds power. No yelling, no panic, just structure. She didn't read him bedtime stories. She taught him encryption. She didn't talk down to him. She talked like he'd be testifying one day. Malik didn't get hugs at the door. He got instructions. Memorize this route. If someone follows you, take the third alley, not the first. Don't run. Don't shout. Be deliberate. Speak facts. Call this number. Use this code. It wasn't a childhood, it was a mission. When Nicole was deployed on a long-term assignment undercover, Malik was placed with his grandmother, Miss Delilah, in a forgotten southern town where last names meant everything and justice was slow to arrive. Delilah was sharp, older than most of the buildings downtown, and respected enough that even the sheriff called her ma'am. But respect didn't extend to Malik. He was new. He was different. And in a town like that, different meant danger. Malik had no plans to stand out until he saw something that made silence unacceptable. It happened behind the gas station, near the loading dock, just after dusk, 3 weeks before the phone booth incident. Malik had taken the long way home, as he often did when his thoughts needed more room than the classroom offered. That night, he paused behind the station and saw 2 police officers, Dempsey and a man called Rourke, shoving envelopes into the glove box of an unmarked truck. The exchange was brief, but the tension was loud. There were no sirens, no paperwork, just side eyes and thick voices. Malik didn't record, he observed. That was step 1. Step 2 came when he started noticing the same truck every Wednesday evening, parked behind the diner, then later by the abandoned railroad depot. Same men, same pattern. Every time, he wrote it down in a coded notebook his mother taught him to keep. He didn't know what they were moving, but he knew they didn't want to be seen. He also knew that, by protocol, this was a qualifying situation for contact. Nicole had drilled it into him like scripture. When trust fails locally, elevate federally. But elevation came with risk. Calling the FBI from a rural southern town as a black kid with no badge, that wasn't just bold, that was an act of war. So Malik planned. He mapped the tower zones around the payphone. He timed the officers' shifts. He even ran a test call to make sure the line wasn't tapped. Then he dialed. Not 911, but the direct number Nicole left him in case of a breach too big to ignore. And when he gave that coded report on a hot afternoon outside that rusted gas station, he knew Dempsey would come. He counted on it. But what Malik didn't expect was how fast the Bureau would respond. The moment Dempsey's phone rang, Malik's world expanded. Everything became motion and consequence. In the minutes that followed, 2 things happened in 2 different places that would tie together like barbed wire around the truth. At the Bureau's Southern Field Office, Nicole Johnson received an alert ping tied to Malik's credentials. At the same time, a digital copy of Malik's field notes, photos, and timestamps hit an encrypted DOJ server. That wasn't Malik being dramatic, that was protocol. That was survival. By the time the black SUVs entered the outskirts of town, the heat had shifted. Not the weather, something else. Something sharper. People at the diner looked out the windows with half-curious, half-fearful glances. Everyone noticed when vehicles that clean rolled through a place that hadn't been repaved Main Street in 20 years. No one said anything, but they watched. And they remembered. Especially in a town where watching was safer than speaking. Malik was escorted home by 2 agents dressed like Sunday preachers, sharp suits, no smiles. Miss Delilah opened the door before they even knocked. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. As Malik walked in, one of the agents handed her a small envelope. Inside was a letter in Nicole's handwriting. They'll try to bury the truth, but he knows how to dig, trust him. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's station, Officer Dempsey was still pacing the hallway when his world began to fracture. He wasn't a man used to being questioned. In his circles, a badge was a shield and a sword. But when that voice on the phone ordered him to stand down, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: irrelevance. And when he got back to the station and saw a DOJ field compliance officer already sitting in the briefing room with a sealed file labeled Internal Corruption Probe, Tier 1, the silence in his bones began to scream. The town's leadership, if you could call it that, scrambled. The mayor made phone calls. The sheriff denied knowledge. Officers deleted texts. But they were too late. Malik's report had already triggered a federal review protocol, one designed to bypass local authorities entirely. It wasn't just about shady deals behind gas stations anymore. It was about patterns, missing evidence, dropped charges, anonymous tips are ignored. All roads converged and all threads pointed back to people who thought they were untouchable. And in the center of it all, quietly and deliberately, stood a 13-year-old boy. Malik didn't seek attention. He wasn't interested in headlines. What he wanted, what he needed, was clarity. If the system couldn't be trusted, it had to be forced to look at itself. That's what Nicole taught him. Justice isn't something you ask for. It's something you document, deliver, and demand. In the days that followed, Malik was interviewed 3 times by 3 separate federal departments. Not once did he change his account. His notebook, coded, precise, and time-stamped, was called a model of procedural integrity by a senior investigator. It wasn't just impressive for a teenager. It was airtight, even by federal standards. But while agents were praising Malik, the town wasn't so kind. Whispers started. At school, classmates avoided him. Some called him a snitch. A few teachers stopped calling on him in class, afraid of being involved. The local paper ran an editorial questioning whether children should meddle in adult affairs. Even the pastor mentioned the danger of false pride during Sunday's sermon. And Malik? He sat through it all with that same quiet stillness. Because he wasn't after approval, he was after the impact. The real shift came when Nicole returned. She didn't walk in like a mother. She entered like a storm wrapped in stillness. Plain clothes, sharp eyes, DOJ credentials clipped to her belt. Malik saw her before the others did, standing at the edge of the school parking lot where reporters had begun to linger. He walked to her without a word. She nodded once. "You did exactly what I taught you," she said, "and more." Together, they met with the federal task force assigned to the case. Malik wasn't just a witness, he became a resource. His field notes were used to connect the local operation with a wider network of dirty cops stretching across 3 counties. An agent even joked, "This kid doesn't just have potential, he has clearance." Nicole didn't laugh. "Potential isn't the point," she said. He had the courage to use it. As pressure mounted, arrests followed. Officer Rourke was the first to be taken in. Then came the clerk who laundered evidence. Then a state trooper. Dempsey, however, held out, denying, deflecting, refusing to step down. One day, his own body cam footage was leaked. It showed him calling Malik a liar. It showed him grabbing the phone. It showed everything. Within 24 hours, he was suspended. And in the silence that followed, something shifted again. Not in the air this time, but in the people. Some teachers apologized. One student said, "I didn't know you were actually, like, FBI smart." Malik didn't correct him. He didn't need to. Because the lesson was never about showing off. It was about showing up. For the truth. For what's right. Even when you're alone. Even when you're 13. The pressure didn't break Malik. It revealed him. What began as a whisper of truth had now become a federal inquiry rolling through town like a thundercloud. Slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. And the boy at the center? He remained still, watchful, calculated, because he knew that justice didn't scream. It waited. Then it struck. Inside a small meeting room at the Department of Justice field office, Malik sat at a long oak table across from 3 men in tailored suits. On the wall behind them, a screen displayed a live map of his town, red flags marking every documented sighting, every time-stamped encounter Malik had written down. To anyone else, it looked like intelligence work beyond his years. To Malik, it was just what his mother taught him to do when adults stopped listening and started assuming. Agent Bell, the one who'd first interviewed him, slid a manila folder across the table. "We cross-checked your timeline with toll camera footage," he said. "You were right. Every car, every meeting, down to the minute." Malik nodded once. He didn't need praise. He needed the next steps. Bell leaned forward. We're building a coordinated takedown, but the sheriff's office has deep ties. We need a trigger. Something public. Something they can't bury. Malik understood. They needed a moment that wasn't just undeniable, it had to be unignorable. That moment came faster than anyone expected. 2 days later, Officer Dempsey pulled over a delivery van on Route 17. Dashcam footage showed the stop began routine, but shifted when the driver, a Latino man, asked why he was being detained. Dempsey accused him of resisting. Then came the shove, the shouting, and finally, a baton strike caught on camera. What Dempsey didn't know was that the van belonged to a subcontractor for the DOJ. The footage went viral before sundown. News outlets picked it up. Hashtags formed. DOJ officials scrambled, but the damage was useful. Now, public interest justified full-scale intervention. By morning, a federal operations unit rolled into the sheriff's station with sealed warrants. And standing with them, stone-faced and unreadable, was Nicole Johnson. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. Her badge did that. So did her presence. Sheriff Wexler tried to downplay it, said it was all procedural, said they'd cooperate fully. But he went pale when they asked for every officer's phone, including Dempsey's, especially Dempsey's. Back at the field office, Malik sat in front of a secure laptop, watching the raid unfold in real time. His notes had guided the entire entry sequence. He'd marked which files were likely doctored, which officers moved evidence off the books, and which patrol cars never turned in logs. And then it happened. A federal analyst flagged a data match. Dempsey's personal phone had received 2 encrypted messages from a number traced back to a shell company linked to narcotics laundering. That wasn't just misconduct. That was organized crime. Nicole entered the room where Malik sat. Her expression didn't shift, but her voice softened just slightly. "We're bringing him in," she said. "He won't see it coming." They let Malik watch. Not out of spectacle, but because he earned that right. He watched as Dempsey walked out of the station in handcuffs, not resisting, not speaking, just stunned. But the most brutal moment came seconds later. As Dempsey was being led to the black SUV, he looked up. Standing across the street in a gray hoodie, arms folded, eyes sharp, was the boy he once called a liar. Their eyes locked. Malik didn't blink. That silence said everything. There's a sound that comes right after a system collapses. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's the sound of excuses losing their voice, of silence turning into consequence. And Malik heard that sound echo across town the moment Dempsey disappeared into the back of a federal SUV. By noon, the sheriff's department was placed under temporary federal supervision. Half the staff were either suspended or under internal review. The mayor tried to hold a press conference, but canceled it after someone leaked the memo that proved he'd received warnings about Dempsey's behavior months ago. A new kind of order was taking shape, one that didn't depend on fear to function. And in the center of that shift stood a boy most of the town still didn't understand. Malik returned to school the next morning. He walked through the hallways like nothing had changed, though everything had. Some students stared. A few nodded. No one said much. But when he sat in third period, the social studies teacher cleared his throat and said, "Malik, would you mind sharing your thoughts on the Fourth Amendment?" The question wasn't a test. It was a recognition. That afternoon, a town hall was called, ostensibly to restore transparency and rebuild trust. In truth, it was damage control. But this time, federal agents sat in the front row. So did Nicole Johnson, and so, unexpectedly, did Malik. The sheriff tried to open the meeting with a pre-written statement. He made it 3 sentences in before a woman from the crowd stood up and said, "Why'd you let that man patrol our streets when you knew?" Another voice added, "Why did it take a child to fix what you ignored?" The room turned, not into chaos, but into clarity. There was no shouting, just the weight of exposure, the sound of a wall crumbling inward. Then someone asked the question no one expected. "Is the boy here?" All eyes shifted. Malik didn't want the attention, but he stood anyway. Not because he wanted to be seen, but because silence was no longer an option. He walked to the mic slowly, his hoodie sleeves pulled over his hands. He didn't have notes. He didn't need them. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," he began. "I just paid attention. I listened. And when things didn't feel right, I didn't pretend they were." The room was silent. "I didn't do what I did to be brave. I did it because someone had to. And maybe that someone didn't have a badge, or a title, or even a driver's license. But I had a notebook. I had a voice. I had facts. And the truth doesn't need permission to matter." He didn't wait for applause. He stepped away before anyone could react. Because Malik wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. He had always been more dangerous than that. He was the proof that a system could be watched from below. That justice doesn't always come from above. And sometimes the smallest witness carries the sharpest evidence. Malik had returned home that night not to cheers or applause, but to the quiet hum of a ceiling fan and the sound of his grandmother's cane tapping the kitchen tile. Miss Delilah didn't ask what happened at the town hall. She didn't need to. She just handed him a glass of water and said, "You still got school tomorrow." That was her way of saying, "I'm proud of you," without spoiling it with words. But the storm wasn't over. It was just repositioning. The next morning, the DOJ quietly issued an internal update. The Malik Johnson case had revealed more than just local corruption. It had tripped a wire buried deep inside an ongoing multi-agency investigation. For nearly 2 years, federal task forces had been tracking encrypted communications tied to off-the-books asset movements. No one had been able to identify the source. Until now. Because one of the burner phones recovered from Officer Dempsey's home pinged, just once, off a secure node used exclusively by the Bureau's Counterintel Division. The digital fingerprint it left behind matched a classified lead buried in a joint operation file, Project Delphi. The moment the name surfaced, the case shifted from local corruption inquiry to national security flagged priority. And Nicole Johnson? She didn't blink. She walked straight into the Washington command room that afternoon and dropped a folder on the table marked Malik Johnson, Tier 1 Witness, Origin, Protected Clearance. Inside were 3 things: a photo of Dempsey's burner phone metadata, a copy of Malik's surveillance notes, and a handwritten field report dated 2 years ago, signed by Nicole herself. The agents around the table froze. One of them leaned forward. "You're saying your son connected this before we did?" Nicole's voice didn't rise. "I trained him to survive. He did more than that." That same day, Malik was officially placed under temporary federal protection, not because he was in danger, but because the Bureau now saw him as operationally relevant. For the first time, a 13-year-old had unknowingly confirmed a pattern their own analysts had been chasing for over 18 months. Not just crooked cops, not just bad apples, but a ring. Carefully concealed, cross-jurisdictional, layered behind decoys and small-town smirks. And Malik had cracked it, because no one was watching him. They underestimated him the way systems underestimate children, especially black children, reading their silence as weakness, their youth as irrelevance. But Malik's quiet was deliberate. His observation was training. His voice wasn't small. It was sharpened. 2 weeks later, Nicole was called to testify in a sealed Senate briefing. She was asked directly how much of her son's involvement had been intentional. She answered without hesitation. "I never asked him to act. I only taught him how to see. He made his own decision. The system failed. He didn't." One senator leaned back and whispered, "That boy might have just bought us 2 years' worth of breakthroughs." Meanwhile, back in town, word began to spread. Not the official story, but fragments of it. Whispers that Malik wasn't just a kid with a good memory. That he knew things. That he wasn't scared when the FBI showed up because somehow he was already part of it. The same classmates who once avoided him now stared too long, some with awe, some with fear. But Malik didn't shift. He still brought the same plain lunch, still read legal reviews during free period, still didn't speak unless he meant to. But then came the twist that no one, not even Nicole, had seen coming. One evening, a woman from the Department of Homeland Security arrived at their house with a sealed packet. Inside were documents showing that a former federal informant had passed intel to Dempsey's unit, intel that was meant to mislead national investigators. In other words, Dempsey wasn't just corrupt, he was being used. By who? That part was redacted. But what wasn't redacted was this. Subject X attempted to intercept communications from junior contact, codename Echo 7. Transmission blocked. The Bureau had underestimated who was listening. And now they knew someone else had tried to intercept Malik's report. Nicole closed the folder slowly. They know his name. The response came swiftly. A new protocol was activated, one reserved for non-agent witnesses tied to intelligence breakthroughs. Malik was debriefed under what's called a circle shield, a layered protection method that kept his identity, location, and involvement sealed across federal systems. Essentially, they erased him, just enough to keep him visible to only the highest levels. At school, Malik became even quieter, not out of fear, but because he now carried weight most adults couldn't fathom. He wasn't scared, but he was aware. Aware that what he'd uncovered was bigger than any town hall, bigger than one bad cop. He had stared into the cracks of the machine and seen how deep they ran. One evening, Nicole found him on the porch, staring into the trees. "You thinking about what happens next?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm thinking about how many kids get ignored, and don't have someone like you." She sat beside him. "You were the someone this time," she said. "You made them listen." It wasn't the headlines that changed Malik. It was the quiet that came after. No more agents at the door. No more federal calls. No more whispered updates about sealed indictments or redacted transcripts. Just mornings that felt like mornings again, and nights that stayed still. But stillness isn't the same as forgetting. Malik kept his notebook, now locked inside a small fireproof safe under his bed, along with the thumb drive Nicole gave him. He didn't open it anymore, not because he was afraid, but because he already knew what it said. Every line of code, every timestamp, every hard truth, memorized, etched into him like a second language. At school, things returned to a kind of normal. The students stopped staring. The teachers stopped avoiding. One even asked if Malik wanted to join the debate team. He declined. Not because he didn't know how to argue, but because real arguments didn't come with trophies. They came with consequences. And he'd already won the kind of debate no stage could hold. One afternoon in civics class, the teacher played a short video on the Bill of Rights. It was well-meaning, animated, polite. Malik watched without reacting. At the end, the teacher turned to the class and asked, "Can anyone give an example of the Fourth Amendment in real life?" No one raised a hand. Then slowly, Malik did. But he didn't talk about himself. He talked about surveillance, about privacy, about why the Constitution matters not when things are calm, but when power decides it can do what it wants. He spoke quietly, clearly, no emotion, just truth. When he finished, no one spoke for a full 10 seconds. And then a kid in the back muttered, "That's real." The teacher nodded. "Yes, it is." Later that day, Malik sat alone at lunch. That part hadn't changed, and maybe it never would. But he was okay with that, because he wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for accountability, and even at 13, he knew those two things rarely lived in the same room. That evening, Nicole found him reading on the porch again, this time a legal textbook thicker than most law students touched in their first year. "You reading ahead?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Just seeing how the system says it's supposed to work," he said, "so I can spot when it doesn't." Nicole smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried weight. Pride, yes, but also the ache of knowing her son had inherited a world that would require him to be twice as prepared just to be heard. "I didn't want this for you," she said softly. Malik closed the book. "I know, but you prepared me for it. That's better." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. Then Malik said almost to himself, "Do you think people will forget?" Nicole didn't answer right away.
Maybe, she said, but the system won't. You left fingerprints inside it, the kind that don't wash off.
So here's what we know. A boy was called a liar. He didn't yell, he didn't fight back. He made a call. And in doing so, he didn't just expose a corrupt officer, he helped dismantle an entire network. Because truth, when carried by someone brave enough to speak it, becomes something bigger than any badge, any office, any threat. It becomes undeniable. And that's what Malik Johnson became. Not a hero, not a headline, but a reminder. That justice doesn't always wear a suit. That intelligence doesn't always come with age. And that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. If this story moved you, share it. Not for us, but for every kid who's ever been silenced, doubted, or dismissed. Let this video remind them. You don't need a badge to be powerful, just the truth and the courage to use it. Subscribe to Radio Life Stories for more real, unforgettable stories of quiet strength and unexpected justice. Because the system watches, but so do we,